Welcome back to part 2 of the SOAS Deaf Track series.
Hi everyone, my name is Bismillah Alizada. I am a PhD candidate at SOAS University of London. Welcome to this follow-on episode. The first episode was titled Afghanistan in Archives, Nationalism, Identity and the State, and it's available on DefTrack website. This episode will take as its focus the migration of people from Afghanistan to neighboring countries in the region and further afield to Europe, including the UK. People from Afghanistan have been migrating in greater numbers to neighboring countries and Europe since the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan in 1979. Earlier, migrations saw some ethnic communities seek refuge in Iran and Pakistan, where long-standing social networks already existed. However, at this time, some people also migrated to Europe, particularly Germany. From the 1990s onwards, Iran and Pakistan enacted harsher migration policies, which disproportionately affected Afghan nationals. As a result, westward migration increased during the civil war and subsequent Taliban rule. Hence, there are now sizable and growing refugee and migrant communities from Afghanistan across Europe in countries such as the UK, Sweden, and Germany. Most of our speakers today have experienced migration themselves. With today's conversation, we hope to provide insights into both the protracted and recent migrations of people from Afghanistan to the neighboring region and further afield to Europe. We will be exploring reasons for migration, treatment upon arrival, and the lived realities for refugees from Afghanistan in their new host countries. Joining me are Reza Hosseini, who is an Afghan researcher and is currently a PhD candidate at City University of London. His original PhD thesis was attempted to use participatory action research with the residents of IDP camps. Interrupted by his evacuation, he has now turned to working with evacuees to the UK, combining PAR and autoethnography. Another participant is Ms. Zarifa Hussaini, who is an Afghan-British undergraduate student at SOAS. She embarked on the irregular migration route from Iran to Turkey and Greece and arrived in the UK in 2019-2020. And the third participant is Ms. Rabia Khan, who is a PhD graduate from SOAS. Her doctoral research focused on Hazara ethnic consciousness. She also holds an LLM in human rights from the same university. Professor Reza, can you explain regional migration from Afghanistan to Iran and Pakistan? More particularly, what is the situation for refugees from Afghanistan in these countries and why these countries have enacted harsher immigration policies over time?
Yeah, thanks, Bismillah, for having me. Actually, mobility of people between Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran has a long history rather than last 40 or 50 years. Looking at the history of this mobility and migration in the region, there were various reasons for this mobility, like trade, pilgrimage, or education. And very good example of this long history of mobility can be seen in Tagore's play Kabuliwala, which was written in 1891. So this mobility of people were never seen as a problem until modern border-crossed people and nation-state emerged. As Shahram Khosravi says, looking at the history, it was border that crossed people, not people who cross borders. So the idea of nation state is based on an imagined community or an identity for people who confine in a geographical area based on a common culture, language, history, which subsequently creates sort of identity. And then a definition of nation must be provided, which at the same time, it means excluded other who did not consider to be part of this nation. In other words, nation state includes some people and exclude other people. So for example, it defines who is an Afghan or who is an Irani or who is an Pakistani. Even human rights begin to be conditional on your membership to the nation, or in another word, to be a citizen. If you are not a citizen, you will be excluded of many human rights like access to education, work, basic human rights. And actually, this is the process we call otherization. This otherization is actually an important concept to understand the discrimination and violence exist and used against migrants and refugees these days all around the world. And the stronger the idea of nation state and nationalism in a community, the stronger the process of othering. And consequently, the greater amount of violence and discrimination against refugees and migrants. For example, ironically, in Iran, which is a country that historically and culturally is most closest to Afghans, but there is the highest level of alienation and otherness toward Afghan in Iranian society. Afghan who have been in Iran for 2 or even 3 generations, their citizenship rights are not still recognized. They never become a citizen, despite the fact that all Afghans have made a great contribution to Iranian society and even Pakistani. And this participation and contribution has always been ignored and not recognized and not acknowledged. And this otherness then paved the way for prejudice, discrimination, and being targeted for racist attacks all the time.
Thank you. Interesting insights from Riza. Now, if we go to Zarifa, can you share some of your lived experiences as a refugee in Iran?
Hi, Bismillah, and thank you so much for having me here. Yes, I would like to mention about some of the experiences that I have experienced myself as a refugee, as a young girl in Iran. The first thing that I want to speak about is the status that a refugee has in Iran. Actually, Afghan refugees have no status in Iran. No matter how long they live in Iran, for example, one Afghan person can live for 20 years, but still they don't have any documents from the Iranian authority that they can have their own home, their own house, or their own car. Basically, they can't have anything under their own name. So that means the Iranian always look upon us in Iran all the time for the whole duration of one person if they were born there until they die in Iran, for example. So that means there is no value for the life of Afghan people in Iran. And if we want to divide, for example, the population in Iran, we have Irani and we have foreigner and we have Afghani. That Afghani doesn't mean that we are foreigner, because Iranian people show a lot of respect to foreigner. For example, the foreigner can be a Chinese person or a Japanese person, and if they see them, they show a lot of respect to them, and they would like to, to having a chat with them or to be like nice to them. But they never feel like an Afghani should be in a level that they can compromise with them or they can call them a friend, because they always look upon them, which brings a lot of discrimination and disadvantages. So very, very low status. The second part probably is the lack of education in Iran, and it's because of most of Afghan people do not have enough documents in Iran, so they are not able to have access to education. Even like primary school or secondary school, it's not always about higher education, which is very difficult to get access. But even for small children like 7 years old or like 10 years old, because they don't have enough documents, so they cannot get enrolled at school and have like the basic reading and writing skills. And then maybe we can focus on other stuff like the low job status, that all Afghan people are always, busy at construction site. The only job that they can have is working at a building, again with very low wage and very high demand, very difficult task. And again, because they don't have status, if they are not being paid, they cannot make any compliment, and they cannot get to the authority and ask for their wage. And I think this situation can be very close to the modern slavery nowadays, to the definition of modern slavery now. And also traveling is a very problematic in Iran. For example, if you are living in the capital of Iran, in Tehran, you are not allowed to go to other cities, for example, to the north of Iran. If the police get you, then you can get imprisoned or you can be fined, and you are supposed to stay in the city that come to that city first. So this is another issue because of that issue. So obviously Afghan people cannot see a lot of the other side of one country and communicate or integrate in that country as well as they can get in another neighboring country, for example, maybe in Pakistan or maybe in Europe. Those are the things that I think I have experienced myself in Iran as well.
Thank you so much, Zarifa. Riza, since you have also lived in Iran, do you want to add anything to that?
I think I also have the same experience which Zarifa described, and it was a total like completion process of the alienation or the otherness of the Afghans in Iran, which consequently who faced like racist behavior from the governments and from the society in Iran the last 40 years.
Rabia, when and why did refugees from Afghanistan, who basically live in Iran, mostly in Pakistan, begin to migrate further west, and how safe the irregular routes that they have taken have been over time?
So, just to briefly add to Zarifa's point, given the kind of marginal status of refugees from Afghanistan, it's been reported that on multiple occasions there have been return migration to Afghanistan, given how severe the situation is for refugees from Afghanistan in Iran in terms of access to education and jobs. So I think that really is a really striking example of how difficult life is for refugees in the country, that post 2001 people were actively deciding to come back to a country that was in a state of war because the situation was so dire in the country that they lived in for several generations. So that's just one kind of brief example to really exemplify how difficult the daily life is for refugees from Afghanistan in Iran. And just to add, in terms of migration to Pakistan, so Reza mentioned about borders and migration and how it's the establishment of these fixed borders that have kind of impeded or caused kind of stagnation or problems in relation to migration. And we can see historic migration also occurred not just to Iran from Afghanistan, but also Pakistan from Afghanistan. So this is quite a historic migration going back pre-1940s when Pakistan was still part of British India. There was very regular migration between Afghanistan and British India at the time, predominantly of ethnic Pashtuns. The next sizable migration took place during the Soviet occupation, again, mostly of ethnic Pashtuns who came to a city called Peshawar, and also then again of ethnic Hazaras who came to another city close to the border with Afghanistan, Quetta. And these migrations at that time saw people come to Pakistan with the belief that they would soon return back to Afghanistan once the war ended, once the Soviet occupation ended. And that was the case of some of those refugees, but some of them actually decided to stay on in Pakistan. So there are sizable ethnic Pashtuns who are native to Afghanistan who have now settled in the western parts and northern parts of Pakistan. Some of them have established quite strong trade networks, have done quite well for themselves, but there are also many Afghan refugees in Pakistan who are now sadly still in a precarious situation, living in refugee camps, working as daily wage laborers, according to a report by the Afghanistan Research and Evaluation Unit. And just to add to that, Paolo Novak of SOAS has said that 1990s onwards was when we saw kind of a very harsher stance taken by the Pakistani government towards refugees from Afghanistan living in Pakistan. He notes that the number of Afghan refugees in Pakistan reduced during the 1990s, as well as protection afforded to refugees from Afghanistan, as they were not automatically recognized as refugees by the state. And one of the harshest policies enacted at the time saw deportations of those without a valid passport and Pakistani visa. And to add to that, in more recent times, if we think of the current situation, since the summer of 2021, the Taliban are now back in power in Afghanistan. They formerly ruled from 1996 to 2001 also. And again, Pakistan has taken a harsh policy decision again to refugees from Afghanistan. For example, it was reported in January 2023 that hundreds of Afghan refugees were being deported from Pakistan back to Afghanistan. And at that time, it was also reported that close to 30 ethnic Hazaras who were on their way to Pakistan from Afghanistan were missing. And there's still no information about what's happened to those people. So that just shows how, sadly, the neighboring countries have taken harsher decisions towards refugees from Afghanistan, but how the migration itself is also very difficult and dangerous for those seeking to leave Afghanistan.
Thank you, Rabia, for providing that additional information and portraying fuller picture of Afghanistan's migration in the region. If you also comment on migration of Afghan nationals from these countries to the West.
Yes, sure. Thank you. So, building on what you said in the introduction, so the kind of first main wave of migration from Afghanistan further west towards Europe took place in the early 1970s. So, that was mainly to Germany. The early 1970s saw students and businessmen make their way to the country, and they stayed on once the Soviet occupation began at the end of the decade. This migration also continued in the 1980s. During the 1980s, the Soviet occupation was continuing. So, again, we saw an increase in westward migration from Afghanistan to Europe at that time. Another significant period is the 1990s. The first half of the 1990s saw a civil war in Afghanistan, which lasted for several years and ended when the Taliban came in power for the first time in 1996. So the civil war itself was another push factor in migration westward to Europe. Similarly, so was the Taliban, the first Taliban rule in the late 1990s to 2001. So again, we saw an increase in migration to Europe. The mid to late 1990s was a time in which there was specific increase in migration to the UK. And again, post 2001, when the NATO invasion began in Afghanistan, there was a period of growing instability given insurgent attacks and fighting between insurgents and the army. So that was another period which saw an increase in migration westward. And then going back to the earlier points of Reza and Zarifa, given the harsh migration policies enacted by neighboring countries, westward migration was seen as a more viable option than trying to migrate to the neighboring countries that were working to send back refugees from Afghanistan. So these were kind of the key periods. Then in the last few years as well, around 2015 onwards, there was an increase in targeted attacks in Afghanistan, attributed to both the Taliban and ISIS in Afghanistan, IS Khorasan province, local affiliate group in Afghanistan of ISIS. So this was another period where we saw increased stability and then increase in migration westwards. And unsurprisingly, 2021 onwards has also seen an increase in migration from Afghanistan to Europe. So the summer of 2021 saw the fall of Republic and the start of the second Taliban rule. So this is another period where we've seen an increase in migration. So given the current dynamics in Afghanistan, we're talking now a year and a half after the fall of Kabul. It appears to me, given the trajectory the country's going in, sadly, in terms of humanitarian crisis and the curtailment of women's rights, that this migration will continue to increase while we see that the fundamental rights of the people of Afghanistan are being denied.
Thank you, Rabia. Reza, since 2014, as the migration of Afghan nationals to Europe peaked, we've also witnessed some insensitive language, for example, like framing the people who are arriving from Afghanistan to European countries as economic migrants, for instance, or less deserving for protection and refugee status, for instance. Now, what do you make of some of these insensitive language used towards refugees, particularly from Afghanistan, in some of the European countries, or I would say most of the European countries? And why has there been such a disconnect between rhetoric and policy in relation to the ground realities in Afghanistan for some of these European countries?
I have been in touch with many Afghan refugees in Europe for a long time, and most of them actually didn't feel welcome in Europe and didn't experience the hospitality they were expected as a liberal democratic countries in Europe, especially at the arrival stage and the process of the asylum seeking. Instead, what they experienced was a hostile environment. Just look at the condition, for example, of Afghan refugees at the Greek camps. To respond to these questions, that why Afghan face such a hostile environment in Europe, we have to look again at the concept of the nation state, which create a binary of citizen versus other, which includes some people as citizen and excludes some people like refugees and migrants. Then, based on that, state define its responsibility toward its nation to those who are its citizen, not others. Then responsibility that the state defined for itself is to protect its nation against other. These other nowadays refugees and migrants were depicted as a threat to the culture and economy, and even in the UK someone is labeled as an invader. And this is why you see militarization of border against refugee. Philosophy of the army is to defend nation border against enemy. Now it's the biggest militarization of border in the history against refugee. For example, EU pay millions of dollars to Turkey to protect Europe borders from refugee and migrants. Although based on international convention, this protection could be extended to a refugee too, not only the nation. People or refugee can seek asylum, but this is the state who make decisions to accept this asylum or not. So they make the label of economic migrants to avoid protection and control migration. And actually this way of thinking about migrants and refugees has reflected on the policy level at EU countries. Just look at the joint way forward agreement between EU and previous Afghan government in 2016. It was a negotiation toward deportation of Afghans saying Afghanistan is safe and you are not a refugee to just stop the migration from Afghanistan. Conditionality of the development aid on the migration control from the Afghan government. And the reason why these policies is failing in the field of migration is a lack of attention to the facts or realities on the ground, which include war, poverty, and global inequality.
Thank you for that. Rabia, why do you think it has taken the UK government so long to start the resettlement program for the refugees from Afghanistan? And what do you make of the use of the language of safe and legal routes for migration by some UK ministers?
So, frankly speaking, I think it has taken so long because the UK government does not really care about refugees. We're now 18 months into the fall of Kabul, and very little has been done in relation to the resettlement of refugees from Afghanistan. Suella Braverman, the current Home Secretary, has said that she dreams of deporting refugees to Rwanda, while her predecessor, Priti Patel, said days after the Taliban takeover of Kabul that the UK cannot take in 20,000 refugees from Afghanistan in one go, and she had pledged that those refugees would be taken in over several years. And this is an important statistic to mention, I believe, because in 2015, over 1 million refugees entered Germany, mostly from Syria and also from Afghanistan. So to claim that 20,000 is a burden to the state and society is just not based in fact when a country with similar socioeconomic circumstances was able to deal with 1 million refugees entering only several years ago. The Afghan Citizens Resettlement Scheme, which is the UK resettlement scheme, officially opened in January 2022, and in February 2023 it was reported by The Guardian that only 22 people had been resettled as part of this scheme. So ultimately I think this comes from the fact that there's no political will to actually help vulnerable people from Afghanistan. And if we think of the language the government has used towards refugees, there's no compassion, refugees more broadly, let alone refugees from Afghanistan. And as Reza has mentioned, for years, refugees from Afghanistan were being demonized. Language like economic migrants was being used when Afghanistan was in a state of war and there was an increase in insurgent attack, and we were being told that the country was safe for return. So I think we have to remember that the situation for refugees from Afghanistan has not been just complicated or problematic in the last 18 months. This has been going on for several years, the dehumanization of refugees from Afghanistan. And then if we think about it in another sense, this very much serves a political interest. It's very beneficial for a government that has very strong anti-migrant, anti-refugee sentiments to say, look, we have a resettlement scheme for refugees from Afghanistan. And on paper it does, but in reality it's not functioning. Hardly anyone has been resettled. So they can say to the electorate, considering we have an election in the UK next year, that there are schemes available to refugees from Afghanistan. So those coming on are violating the territorial integrity of the country. They're engaging in forms of illegal migration, obviously a problematic term because there's no such thing as illegal migration. As a refugee, you have the right to claim asylum in any safe country you enter. That includes the UK. We're a party to the 1951 Refugee Convention. So I now feel that these delays are very much deliberate and they kind of help with a political agenda that is aimed at demonizing and dehumanizing refugees. Coming to your point about the use of the term safe and legal routes, I think that's highly problematic that such language is routinely being used in political discourses and also by the media because it's in fact misleading. Going back to the previous point, under international law, nobody's illegal. Anyone claiming asylum has the right to do so, and they have the right to do so in any country that they deem to be safe. So the government claims that the irregular migration entry is illegal and claiming that there are safe and legal routes. But as we know, the resettlement scheme is barely functioning. So there isn't actually a, quote, safe and legal route, as the government claims, for refugees from Afghanistan. Because if we think about what's happening on the ground in Afghanistan, there's currently no British embassy in Kabul. People can't go and obtain visas from the embassy because there isn't one. The other option is taking the dangerous and costly land route over to neighboring Pakistan, which would involve the use of people smugglers. So again, if that's what the government is inadvertently aiming for, then it goes against their own rhetoric because they're claiming that people smugglers are the problem. But in another situation, they're willing to ignore the fact that people are having to rely on people smugglers to undertake the so-called safe and legal route by seeking to obtain a visa in Pakistan and then fly over to the UK, as opposed to come over via boats from France to the UK. So I've gone on a bit here, but I do think ultimately that this language is very troubling as it misinforms the public. But I feel that that's kind of the government's agenda here. So in that sense, it works in their favor.
Thank you so much, Rabia. Riza, would you like to add to that?
I think, as Rabia said, these safe and legal routes is only exist on the paper and it's not working really. In fact, the main criticism is that they, on the one hand, states criminalize migration and use all their strength and to prevent the entry of migrants and refugee. But they have never say what is a safe route for refugee from Afghanistan, for example, or other countries to come to the UK. Does anyone who lives in Afghanistan and his life, for example, is in danger have any other way rather than irregular migration? You must remember, Bismillah, that the embassies in Kabul nowadays are closed. Even at that time that was open, it was so difficult to reach through that walls and lots of problems. So how do you or anyone come to Britain when your life is in danger by the dominant group, and the idea of the safe and legal route is something that is everyone looking for, but it doesn't exist. So people just put their life in risk to come.
Thank you for that. Zarifa, what will have to happen, in your view, in order for refugees from Afghanistan to be treated more humanly, maybe at the social level, at the policy level?
Mhm. Well, if I want to speak about my own experience, came to the UK in 2019 and 2020. We came, I mean, when I say we, my younger brother, who was 14 years old, and myself, I was 16 years old when we both came to the UK as unaccompanied minors through legal routes from Greece to the UK through reunification case with my sister who was here in the UK for more than 10 years. So the first thing that we really faced with lots of difficulties was not having enough social supports, like having a social worker or any support from the government itself. So I had to find everything myself, including getting registered at the GP or find a college or even a school for my younger brother. And it was very difficult because I was struggling with the language, and also the education system in the country was absolutely new to me. And I was lucky enough to know English a little bit, and then to follow up all the ways that we can put ourselves in the education, because it was the big goal for us because of all the difficulties that we've been through and getting to a safe country with lots of opportunities. So we wanted to have the education. So I think even now, because I still have a lot of connection with refugees in the UK, they are all complaining about not having enough access to education, and especially providing language courses like the English course, that they can give them probably enough confidence that they can integrate in the society, and maybe providing them situation that they can have a better job in society, because they have 12 months until they can find a job. Before that, they are not allowed to have a job in the UK. And also, speaking about new refugees after the collapse of Afghanistan in August 2021, I know myself, we have some distant relatives, the Afghan families that they came here. They have been stuck in the hotels since August 2021 until then, and they don't have a home. And this relative that I am speaking about is a very old grandma with 3 children that she brought with herself from Afghanistan. And this old grandma is very sick, and most of the time she is complaining about this food situation, for example, at the hotel, or the lack of healthcare support at the hotel. But unfortunately, because they are in a hotel, they can't do anything. Obviously, if they have their own space, like their own home and their own kitchen, they can provide maybe their own food, and it can probably give them more space to get engaged and to get busy to not suffering from the mental health condition. And probably we can even mention about the providing this mental health supporters, because again, the refugees that I know, all of them actually, including myself when I came to this country, because of the dangers that we've been through, to get to these countries illegally, so all of us are traumatized quite highly, and we need this social support, especially the therapists, that they can give us some, probably some tips, some support and helps that we can get involved in some other activities to forget about those things that we've been through. Adding up to the, providing social services, probably mental health supporters, and also the education system, if they can provide like the English courses for the refugees.
Thank you so much. Based on your lived experiences, what risks do you think migrants face along the routes, particularly vulnerable individuals like women, unaccompanied minors?
Well, I would like to answer this question based on my own experience, because obviously I took this illegal route with my family in 2019. First of all, it is a very difficult decision to make this illegal journey, as all the family member is aware of the risk and danger of it, especially if this journey is involving girls and women, as they are more vulnerable. And this journey is a very long journey. For example, when we left Iran toward Turkey, there were 12 people in a four-seated car instead of 4 people for 12 hours. And if we were caught by the police at the middle of the way, it was a risk of getting deported to Afghanistan at that time. And they don't look that you are still in the country of Iran, so they can deport you even before getting to Turkey. So Iran, the other difficult part of this journey is, being at the border in Iran, and the police, knowing that the Iranian police have the right to shoot guns at the border. And I heard it myself at the border when it was the time that my younger brother and myself separated from our parents. And for 3 years, we thought they are dead, as we had no idea where they were living or if they are alive, and they had no idea where we are. And also getting to so many difficulties that we got to Turkey, then we were in the hands of the smugglers, and we had no power over what we were eating, when we were gonna move to the next step, or where we're gonna stay, or for how long we're gonna stay in the smugglers' homes. And getting to Greece from Turkey through the sea on the inflatable boats put our life in high risks for 4 times, as our boat was sinking every time that we were trying to get to the Greece, because of the plastic boats and the number of the people that they were inside these boats. And finally we made it to Greece after 4 times trying, and when we arrived in Greece, we expected like a nice place, probably a better situation with like nice people around us, and probably a good school, friendly faces. But unfortunately, when we arrived in Greece, in the camp that was called Moria camp, in an island that was called Mytilene, the situation in the refugee camp was terrible, and it was getting quite scary, especially at the end of each month, because refugees were receiving some money from the authorities, and they were spending this money for drinks, so they could get drunk, and they could rape women, and they could assault sexually, even men, because that camp was in a remote place in the middle of a forest. So there were so many young men and women that they experienced rape, sexual assault, unfortunately. And I feel so lucky that I never experienced, but I was very cautious about who I'm talking to, where I'm going, and lots of other factors that they probably can minimize the risk of these kind of incidents. And also, Greek people in the island, again, they were not really friendly enough. So again, I experienced racism even at the beginning of putting my feet in Europe. That was Greece. So And even I heard about the fascism movement, that sometimes they were beaten up with refugees. Some of them could quietly hurt and they taken to the hospital because of the severe damage that they could put on the refugees' life. This fascism movement. Probably the last thing that I can say about this journey. Obviously, there are a lot of aspects of these dangerous journeys, but again, even there are some hope and legal routes for this kind of journey. Again, it's very frustrating and it's very long. For example, when we were waiting for the decision of the British authority to come to the UK, it took us almost over a year. Some other people that, for example, traveling to Germany, they could get a positive answer within 5 months. So even it probably like 1 year is not too long, but obviously you wait every second of this year, and every day lasts you forever. So it was very difficult also to get through this legal journey and to come to the UK. But again, when we arrived here, we faced a lot of difficulties as well as refugee. And again, starting from the 0 point, seeking asylum here in the UK, although we came here legally. That was all of the points that probably I wanted to mention about this question. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Zarifa, and a big thank you to Rabia and Liza for participating in today's. Also, thank you so much for everyone who listened to this podcast. You can read more about our recent publication titled How to Do Research on Afghanistan's State, Society and People During the Crisis via the SOAS website. You can also email us on soasafgevents@gmail.com to get more information about future events. Thank you.